Picture this: you're standing before the tall, soot-darkened brick walls of a Victorian asylum sometime around 1885. The morning air is damp and heavy with the scent of coal smoke and wet earth, and beyond the iron gates lies a world few would ever choose to see. But tonight, we are stepping across that threshold together to understand what life truly meant for those confined within these walls. Before we slip inside, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from tonight and what the time is for you right now. I find it remarkable that these hidden corners of the past can bring us together, scattered across continents yet gathered here to listen. And if these deep dives into forgotten worlds speak to you, like this video and consider subscribing, but only if you genuinely find value in what I do here. Now let's walk through the main gate. The first thing that strikes you is the size. Victorian asylums were vast institutions, purpose-built to house hundreds, sometimes thousands of souls who were deemed unfit for the ordinary rhythms of society. Many were perched on the edges of cities or buried deep in the countryside, isolated by intention as much as by geography. Here, the insane, the disturbed, the misunderstood, and sometimes merely the inconvenient were shut away under the banner of care. To enter a Victorian asylum in the late 19th century was to surrender every shred of personal freedom. It often began with a simple slip of paper, a certificate signed by 2 doctors and a relative, declaring a person of unsound mind. Some were truly suffering from conditions we would now recognize as schizophrenia, severe depression, dementia, or epilepsy. Others were merely troublesome wives, rebellious daughters, paupers too frail to work, or elderly men who had become a burden on the parish. Once committed, few ever saw the outside world again. Step inside the admission hall. Under the stern gaze of a superintendent in a dark frock coat, you would be inspected, questioned, and recorded in thick ledgers that chronicled your name, age, supposed cause of insanity, and your next of kin. Though for many, family ties ended at this door. You would be stripped of your clothing, washed in a communal bath, your belongings stored away or burned for fear of lice and contagion. Uniforms were issued, drab wool gowns for women, rough jackets, and trousers for men. The transformation from person to patient began here, where your past life, your profession, your marriage, your reputation, was left behind like an old coat. The day would begin early. Woken at dawn by the shrill clang of a handbell or the barked orders of attendants, hundreds of patients shuffled from their iron beds to the washrooms, communal spaces lined with cold basins and wooden benches. Privacy was a luxury few could afford here. Attendants watched as patients washed and dressed, ensuring none lingered too long or spoke out of turn. For many women, the indignity of being bathed by male orderlies was an unspoken shame, a reminder of how completely they had been stripped of ordinary decency. The dormitories themselves were long, echoing halls lined with rows of narrow iron bedsteads. In older asylums, the floors were flagstone, the windows barred and high up on the walls. Blankets were thin, the mattresses often little more than straw sacks. Heating was meager at best. In winter, frost formed on the inside of the window panes, and breath hung in clouds above the beds. Yet even this chill was preferable to the suffocating summer months, when so many bodies packed close together turned the wards into stifling chambers of sweat and stale air. Sleeping in a Victorian asylum was rarely peaceful. Patients lay in rows, separated only by a narrow gap. Snores, mutters, and the occasional muffled sob drifted through the dormitory like restless ghosts. For the severely disturbed, sleep brought no comfort. Night terrors and delusions made them cry out or thrash in their beds, waking others who lay silently listening, too fearful to close their eyes again. Orderlies patrolled the wards at intervals, their footsteps echoing on stone floors as they checked that no one had slipped away or harmed themselves in the night. Suicide was an ever-present fear. Strips of bedsheet or scraps of clothing could be turned into makeshift nooses. Windows were barred not only to keep patients in, but to keep desperate souls from leaping into oblivion to escape a lifetime of confinement. The asylum day was governed by strict routine. Breakfast at 7, work assignments by 8. Labor was seen as both cure and control. Men were sent to the gardens, the farms, the workshops. They tended fields, chopped wood, repaired shoes, built furniture. Women scrubbed floors, mended linen, worked the laundry in rooms so hot that the walls wept with condensation. This relentless order left little time for idle thought. An occupied mind, the doctors believed, could be healed of its madness through discipline and repetition. Yet when night returned and the wards were locked once more, the fragile calm cracked open. Some patients whispered to themselves, repeating half-remembered prayers or scraps of songs. Others rocked back and forth in their beds, eyes wide open in the darkness. For the most troubled souls, sleep came only with restraint. Leather straps secured them to beds, straitjackets kept restless arms pinned through the long hours until dawn returned and the cycle began anew. By the time the first rays of daylight pushed through the grime-dulled windows of a Victorian asylum, most patients had already been awake for hours. Sleep, when it came, arrived not as a gentle respite but as a thin, fragile drift easily broken by the shouts of the disturbed or the patrol of booted attendants pacing the dormitory aisles. As the sun rose, the vast, echoing buildings stirred with a heavy, weary energy. Bells rang again, summoning patients from their cold beds to begin another day that mirrored the last with uncanny precision. Once the morning ablutions were complete, men and women gathered in separate dining halls. These cavernous spaces were functional rather than comforting: long wooden tables, benches bolted to the floors, plain tin dishes stacked and ready. The meals themselves were predictable and cheap. Porridge made from coarse oats, often lukewarm by the time it reached the far end of the hall. Bread thick with stale crumbs, sometimes spread with dripping or a thin smear of butter if the asylum budget permitted. Tea brewed in enormous copper urns, strong and bitter enough to disguise the taste of the water drawn from the asylum's deep, often questionably maintained wells. Patients ate in near silence, under the watchful eyes of attendants who patrolled the aisles, ready to bark reprimands at anyone who lingered over their food or dared speak out of turn. Some patients wolfed down every crumb with the hunger of the perpetually underfed. Others poked at their food, too lost in their own thoughts or troubles to muster an appetite. Food could be withheld as punishment for disobedience, one more lever of control in a place where obedience was survival. After breakfast, the day's work began. Victorian asylums prided themselves on being largely self-sufficient communities. Every able-bodied patient was expected to contribute labor, both as a cost-saving measure and as therapy. For the doctors and superintendents of the age, idleness was not just a sin, it was seen as the root of madness itself. Men who were judged strong enough were sent outside, regardless of weather. They dug gardens, tended pigs and cows, laid new pathways or repaired broken fences. Some toiled in workrooms, shoemakers' benches, carpenters' tables, smithies echoing with the ring of hammer on iron. For the men, these hours of labor provided not only meager occupation but also a taste of the outside world, however faint, the smell of earth and hay, the flicker of birds overhead, the cold air biting at their skin. Many clung to these small freedoms. Inside, the women worked under equally watchful eyes. They scrubbed vast expanses of flagstone floors, polished stair rails worn smooth by decades of passage, laundered endless piles of sheets and uniforms stained with sweat and worse. The laundry was an ordeal in itself. Great copper vats bubbled and steamed, filling the air with a damp heat that turned the washrooms into suffocating caves. Women bent over the vats, stirring heavy linens with wooden paddles, then wringing them out with blistered hands. Soap burned raw skin, and the iron mangle, a giant press used to squeeze water from fabric, claimed more than one patient's fingers when the work grew careless from exhaustion. In some institutions, sewing rooms offered a quieter form of occupation. Women mended uniforms or stitched coarse hospital gowns from scratch. This work demanded precision, yet the constant hum of whispered weeping or muttered prayers reminded everyone present that even stillness in an asylum was never truly calm. Doctors roamed these wards, clipboards in hand, recording observations for their medical reports. Some genuinely believed they were helping. They studied patients for signs of improvement, hoping that routine and industry would restore the troubled mind to balance. But the tools at their disposal were crude and often cruel. Bleeding, purging, blistering. These were common treatments for the so-called hysterical or melancholic. Patients might be forced to swallow draughts of foul-tasting bromides or sedatives that dulled the mind but brought no real peace. Hydrotherapy, which could mean anything from soothing baths to hours strapped in a tub of cold water, was hailed as a modern cure, but for many was simply another form of control. Outside the working hours, moments of leisure were rare and strictly regimented. Once the day's labor ended, patients might be allowed to gather in day rooms. These spaces were stark, with hard benches and worn floors, but in winter, they offered the one warm place in the entire institution, a single coal stove or fireplace at which dozens clustered, desperate for the fleeting comfort of heat. Here they sat, some in silence, others mumbling to themselves or staring at nothing. Conversation was discouraged unless it served the superintendent's idea of moral uplift, reading the Bible aloud, reciting hymns, or listening to lectures meant to improve the restless mind. For a handful of patients, especially those from wealthier families who paid extra fees for better care, small privileges might soften these hours: a book to read, a private room with a thicker mattress, perhaps a single chair by the window where they could watch the outside world they would never touch again. But these comforts were few and far between. As dusk fell, the routine closed in once more. Bells summoned patients back to the dormitories. Shoes were lined neatly beneath iron beds, or blankets turned down by weary hands. The attendants performed final checks, counting heads, tightening the straps for those whose nights brought danger to themselves or others. Some patients lay down quietly, surrendering to exhaustion. Others fought sleep, afraid of what dreams or waking visions might come. Some nights, the dormitory fell quiet quickly, the air heavy with the damp breath of hundreds sleeping in rows. Other nights, shrieks rang through the halls, the cries of a woman gripped by unseen horrors, the low, choked sobs of a man remembering a world he would never see again. For those who still had strength to hope, the darkness offered the same fragile promise each night, that perhaps tomorrow would be different, kinder, or at least bearable. Beyond the main dormitories and communal wards lay the darker heart of the Victorian Asylum, the closed wards and padded cells where the most disturbed or disruptive patients were kept apart from the general population. Here, sleep was not simply elusive, it was a battleground between restless minds and the cold instruments of 19th-century care. Walking down these inner corridors, the air grows colder despite the building's brick bulk. Windows here are narrower still, some no larger than a slit, admitting just enough grey daylight to cast long shadows on the scrubbed stone floors. Iron hinges groan as attendants make their rounds, keys clinking like a muted chorus that echoes through the halls. Each heavy door conceals a world of restless nights and watchful days. In padded cells, small chambers lined with straw-stuffed canvas or horsehair panels, the so-called violent patients slept alone on bare mattresses laid directly on the floor. The padding was intended to prevent self-injury, though the thick, stale air and constant dampness bred sores and infections that few doctors cared to treat. There were no blankets to twist into ropes, no loose furniture to hurl in rage or despair. Some patients were left restrained through the night, wrists and ankles bound so they could not claw at themselves or the walls. Doctors and attendants of the era recorded these scenes in dry, clinical language, incoherent utterances, unmanageable excitement, nocturnal restlessness. But behind these notes lay the raw reality of sleepless terror. Patients in these cells often raved through the night, crying out to figures only they could see, begging for family who would never come. The walls absorbed their voices until the whole building seemed to murmur with the restless echoes of those who could not find rest within their own minds. For some, the closed wards were a sentence that lasted years. Families who could not bear the shame of an openly insane relative sometimes paid for private isolation, believing it kinder than exposing their loved one to the crowded public wards. But in truth, these rooms often bred deeper torment. The isolation was meant to calm the mind through enforced silence and routine, but more often it frayed what little sanity remained. Alone with their thoughts, patients paced small circles day after day, month after month, until pacing itself became a compulsion that even exhaustion could not break. Treatments in these wards mirrored the confusion and fear that surrounded mental illness in the 19th century. Doctors tried everything they could think of, purgatives and bleeding in the early decades, then ice baths and hydrotherapy as the century wore on. One favored approach was the continuous bath. A patient might be submerged in lukewarm or cold water for hours, even days at a stretch, with only the head exposed. The belief was that the steady temperature calmed overwrought nerves, yet for those trapped within the bath's canvas slings, it was more prison than cure. Many drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, their skin pruned and raw, while attendants patrolled to ensure they did not slip under or attempt to climb out. Sedation was another tool of the Victorian Asylum. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was administered to calm mania or sleeplessness, its bitter taste forcing down minds into duller states of half-dream. Chloral hydrate joined the regimen later in the century, an early sleeping draught meant to quiet the night terrors that plagued so many. But these potions dulled more than just the mind. They eroded speech, will, appetite. Patients drifted through days and nights in a haze, too sedated to cause trouble but also too subdued to recover in any meaningful way. For the most desperate cases, those who tore at their own flesh, who screamed until hoarse, physical restraint remained the final answer. The straitjacket, a device of heavy canvas with long sleeves crossed and tied behind the back, was seen as a mercy by some superintendents, who preferred it to beatings or the whip. Some patients wore these restraints day and night for weeks at a time, muscles atrophying under the constant pressure. Lying in bed bound so tightly that the chest could barely rise with each breath, sleep became a shallow thing, more faint flickers of unconsciousness than true rest. Yet amid these grim realities, fragments of humanity persisted. Some attendants, often poorly paid and poorly trained, found ways to soften the rigid rules. A trusted patient might be unbuckled for an hour to stretch their arms or allowed to sit by a small window if they were calm. Nurses who stayed through the night sometimes hummed low songs or read aloud to the more lucid patients, their voices a thin lifeline in the endless darkness. Such kindnesses were never guaranteed and always at the mercy of the institution's mood, but for the souls locked away in the padded cells, even a single hour of gentle words could linger like a candle in the deep night. Outside these closed wards, in the larger dormitories and side rooms, the divisions of class and gender shaped the night as surely as the iron keys and stone walls did. Wealthier patients often secured smaller, semi-private rooms where a single bed, a washstand, perhaps a chair and Bible made the difference between survival and surrender. For them, the hush of the asylum night might come with a measure of dignity, though the walls remained thin enough to carry the groans and cries from the common wards just beyond. As the century turned and the Victorians edged toward new understandings of the mind, the dark corners of these institutions remained stubbornly unchanged. Padded cells were never truly empty. When one patient found peace, another was brought in to take their place. The echo of locked doors and padded walls lingered as a reminder that in this world, sleep was never simple, never gentle, and never guaranteed. Outside the locked wards and padded cells, another kind of restless vigil unfolded each night within the sprawling walls of the Victorian Asylum. The long, thankless shifts of the attendants, nurses, and night watch staff who moved like silent sentries through the endless corridors. Their lives, too, were shaped by sleepless hours and the constant weight of other people's troubled dreams. Most attendants were drawn from the local working class, farmhands, laborious, sometimes former patients themselves judged recovered enough to serve but never fully trusted. Their duties were demanding and poorly paid, and the line between guardian and jailer blurred easily in the stale lamplight that flickered down the asylum halls. As dusk settled and the final bell signaled the end of the patient's working day, these attendants prepared the dormitories for night. Straw mattresses were shaken out, thin blankets checked for hidden tears or signs they might be ripped to fashion ropes. Bedpans were placed under beds, as many wards locked their lavatories until morning, forcing patients to use the simple enamel or tin pots kept beneath each iron frame. Candles or oil lamps were lit just enough to cast a dim glow. Too bright a flame was considered wasteful and risked mischief among the more restless patients. For the night staff, the work was a cycle of routine and vigilance. Each hour was marked by a quiet circuit of the dormitories and closed wards. Keys rattled at belts, boots scuffed across stone, and every creak of the floorboards reminded the watchers that nothing in these buildings ever truly slept. Some attendants sat at the ends of long rows of beds, their chairs angled to see as many faces as possible at once. They looked for the rise and fall of chests under wool blankets, for the telltale twitch of a body stirring too often, for the low murmur of voices that might grow into a restless disturbance. In the men's wards, attendants kept watch for fights that flared up in the darkness, sudden bursts of violence from minds that could not settle. A muttered insult or an imagined slight was enough to send fists flying. In the women's dormitories, The risks often came from within. Self-harm was common, the product of despair and confinement. A scrap of cloth tucked beneath a pillow, a hidden shard of glass pilfered from a broken window. Small things became desperate tools in hands that had lost hope of any other escape. When trouble came, the response was swift and rarely gentle. Patients found fighting or trying to harm themselves were restrained in their beds or marched to the isolation wards. If they struggled too fiercely, several attendants would pin them down and bind their arms, the knots pulled tight enough to discourage any further attempts. Their cries might wake half the ward, but sleep would return faster than the faint chance of mercy. For the attendants themselves, these nights blurred into one another. Meals were taken standing up or snatched in cold hallways, bread and cheese, a mug of weak tea poured from a dented pot kept warm over a coal stove. The lucky ones, those trusted by the head nurse or the ward matron, might slip outside for a few minutes in the early hours, standing in the bitter night air, smoking a pipe behind the laundry block while the gaslights inside flickered and hummed. But the building always called them back. There was no true break when dozens of souls lay restless and watched. Nurses, mostly women by the later decades of the century, worked under rules that offered them little more freedom than the patients they tended. They were expected to be guardians of both order and morality, gentle enough to soothe a weeping patient, stern enough to enforce silence when whispered conversations threatened the calm of the night. Many were unmarried women with few other prospects, drawn by the promise of steady wages and a roof overhead, even if the hours stretched endlessly and the demands of the wards wore their health to a thread. Training was minimal for most. A lucky few trained under the new wave of modern matrons who pressed for cleanliness, efficiency, and a touch of mercy, inspired by the reforms championed by pioneers like Florence Nightingale. But more often, young nurses learned on the job, how to calm a fit of hysteria, how to wrap bandages around wrists torn by desperate fingernails, how to speak firmly enough to hush a dormitory but softly enough to be trusted by the lonely minds they served. Sleep for the staff came in short snatches, taken on hard cots in side rooms or not at all. Between the rounds, the nurses might doze sitting upright, their aprons still pinned, their caps tilted askew. They woke at the slightest sound, the scrape of a chair leg, the low sob of a patient calling for a mother who would never come, the slam of a door as a doctor made an unexpected night visit. There was no room for complaint. The institution demanded watchful eyes and steady hands until the dawn bell rang out again. Yet even in these grim routines, moments of quiet humanity flickered to life. A nurse might slip an extra blanket to an old man shivering in his thin gown. An attendant might hum a folk tune, soft and half-forgotten, to lull a troubled sleeper back toward uneasy rest. These small kindnesses rarely appeared in the official records. The ledgers were filled with medical notes and treatment regimens, but they never mentioned the gentle touch that steadied a shaking hand, the whispered reassurance that maybe, if they were good and quiet, tomorrow would bring a letter from home. Morning came eventually for everyone, for the patients, roused by bells and the clatter of boots, for the night staff, who handed over their keys with bleary eyes and stiff backs, returning to narrow cots behind locked doors where they would snatch their own fragile sleep before dusk called them back again. And so the cycle turned, night after night, in buildings designed to contain madness but which often bred despair as well. To understand what life and sleep truly meant inside these walls, it helps to follow one pair of footsteps down the endless corridors, to trace the days and nights of someone who, by accident of illness or misfortune, found themselves surrendered to the Victorian Asylum's care. Imagine, then, a young woman named Mary Whitcomb. In 1887, she was 22 years old when her father brought her to the gates of a county asylum not far from Manchester. The reasons for her committal were written in careful, looping script in the admission ledger: melancholia, following the death of mother, prone to silence and refusal of food, unmanageable by family. She had not spoken more than a handful of words in months. Her eyes, once bright with laughter over market stalls and Sunday picnics, stared at the floor as two nurses led her inside. In that moment, the life she had known was gone. Mary's first nights in the asylum were a blur of confusion. She found herself in a long women's ward with 30 iron beds lined side by side, each separated by nothing more than a few inches of cold air. The first night, she did not sleep at all. She lay rigid on the straw mattress, listening to the low, haunted mutter of other women drifting in and out of restless dreams. An older woman in the bed beside her coughed through the dark hours. Somewhere at the far end of the ward, a young girl whispered prayers into her blanket until an attendant barked at her to hush. When sleep did come, it was fractured by sudden jolts awake, a dream of her mother's face, the clang of keys, the soft sob of someone who could not hold the fear inside anymore. Mary learned quickly that in this place, night was not for rest but for enduring. Each morning brought the same ritual. A nurse wrapped her bed frame with a wooden stick, commanding her to rise. Cold water in a cracked basin, the same rough wool dress pulled over thin shoulders, the same tin cup of tea waiting in the dining hall. Mary, like so many others, was expected to earn her keep. She joined the laundry, standing with sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hands raw from soap and steam. The weight of wet linen pulled at her thin arms as she fed sheets through the iron mangle. Her mind drifted, but the endless motion of washing, wringing, folding pulled her back each time. At night, exhaustion did not guarantee sleep. The dormitory seemed to pulse with restless thoughts, worries that spread from bed to bed. In the first weeks, Mary lay awake with her eyes on the ceiling, counting the cracks, mouthing the words of hymns her mother had once sung by the hearth. Sometimes she wept into her blanket, careful not to let her sobs rise too high. The attendants did not take kindly to noise after lights out. As days blurred into weeks, Mary learned the small survival rituals that could make a night more bearable. She made a friend, Sarah, a woman who had been inside for nearly a decade after her husband's sudden death drove her into silence and fainting fits. Sarah whispered old stories to Mary after the gaslights were dimmed, tales of her garden roses and summer hayfields, of the soft rush of the river behind her childhood cottage. The stories did not bring sleep, but they softened the dark, made the echo of the asylum's walls seem less endless. Mary learned, too, how to hold herself small when the nurses made their rounds. She kept her hands folded, her eyes closed even when she was still awake, her breathing slow and steady so they would pass by without notice. On good nights, this bought her a few moments alone with her thoughts, precious pockets of privacy that no locked door could fully steal. But the asylum had other ideas for those who did not improve. When her appetite failed again and her spirit slipped further inward, Mary was ordered to the hydrotherapy rooms. 2 attendants led her through tiled corridors to a small stone chamber, where a deep tub waited, half filled with cold water that steamed faintly in the chill air. She was undressed without ceremony, lowered into the water, a wet sheet wrapped tight around her arms and chest to hold her still. The nurse's voice was calm but firm. "For your own good, Miss Whitcomb." Mary's lips turned blue as she lay in the bath, her thoughts drifting somewhere far beyond the walls. Time blurred in the echoing drip of water from cracked pipes overhead. Back in the dormitory that night, Mary slept as if drugged, her body numbed by hours in the bath. But the sleep was dreamless, heavy, more like sinking into a pit than drifting into rest. When she woke at dawn, her muscles ached, her skin still cold beneath her woolen gown. For those judged dangerous to themselves, stronger measures waited. One night, Sarah, gentle Sarah, began to wail, her voice rising and falling like a lost hymn. She tore at her hair, crying out for her husband long dead. Attendants came quickly, 2 men and a nurse with leather straps and canvas buckles. They wrapped her in the straitjacket while she rocked and sobbed, her cries muffled against the rough fabric. They laid her back on her bed, fastened her ankles to the iron frame. Mary lay frozen in her own bed, eyes wide in the darkness, listening to Sarah's breathing slow as exhaustion and despair settled over her like a heavy quilt. The days turned, and Mary drifted deeper into the routine that dulled thought and blurred memory. She learned which nurse might slip her an extra slice of bread, which attendant to avoid when his temper ran hot. She learned that a nod and a quiet yes, nurse smoothed the way more than any outburst could. And still, each night, she lay on the same narrow bed, hands tucked beneath her thin pillow, staring at the dark rafters until the dawn bells called her back to the same rooms, the same chores, the same dull grey thread of existence. To understand how the Victorians believed sleep could be coaxed from troubled minds like Mary's, we must look at the philosophy that shaped the brick walls and iron beds of the asylum itself, the so-called moral treatment that promised to replace the chains and dungeons of earlier centuries with order, routine, and what reformers called kind discipline. In the early 19th century, the old Bedlam image of the madhouse, where the insane were chained in filthy cells and shown off to paying visitors, began to give way to a new ideal. Enlightened doctors argued that madness was not possession or criminality but an illness of the mind and spirit, one that could be soothed if the patient was kept calm, occupied, and gently guided back to reason. The asylum became the physical embodiment of this hope, vast, orderly, a kind of village sealed away from the chaos of the outside world. The days were planned with almost military precision. Waking at dawn, washing, prayers, breakfast, then work, in the gardens, the laundries, the farms, until the midday meal, another round of labor in the afternoon, and then supper before dusk fell. For many patients, this rigid routine replaced the disorder of their own thoughts with something concrete and predictable. Doctors spoke proudly of the quiet wards, where patients rose and slept like clockwork, the hum of the asylum a balm to the restless mind. For some, this discipline did bring a measure of peace. An elderly man too frail to remember the year might find comfort in sweeping the same path each day. A young woman who had once paced city streets barefoot and raving might calm under the watchful routine of scrubbing floors or tending flower beds. It was not cure, but it was containment, a way to shape the chaos into a daily pattern. Yet beneath this theory of benevolence lay a truth few superintendents would admit aloud. Routine alone could not mend a mind ravaged by grief, dementia, epilepsy, or despair. Many patients like Mary lay awake each night with minds racing or dulled by drafts, their bodies worn from labor yet unable to find true rest. When routine failed, other measures stepped in. Doctors experimented with treatments that promised to tame the mind's storms. The swing, a contraption like a giant cradle suspended from the ceiling, was one such device. Patients were strapped in and swung back and forth for hours, the motion meant to soothe agitation and induce sleep. Some patients vomited or fainted from the relentless motion, but the theory held: force the mind to quiet by exhausting the body senses. Then there was the wet sheet pack, a treatment that became a staple in asylums across Britain. The patient was stripped, wrapped tightly in cold, damp sheets, then bound again in dry blankets and left to lie still on a narrow bed for hours. Some patients found a strange calm in the weight and chill, a feeling not unlike drifting underwater. Others felt trapped, smothered in the damp folds with no choice but to surrender to whatever uneasy dreams might come. Opium tinctures, bromides, chloral hydrate, each was prescribed to still the mind and force sleep where routine and hydrotherapy could not reach. Laudanum dulled pain and thought alike, a soft veil that settled over the chaos inside a patient's skull. Chloral hydrate, hailed as a modern miracle when it first appeared in the 1860s, was slipped into cups of tea or thick broths ladled out before lights out. Some patients sank into heavy slumber, dreams sliding into blankness. Others grew dependent, their minds clouded by the residue of daily doses, caught between shallow sleep and waking stupor. The asylum's theory of moral treatment extended beyond the wards. Architecture itself was considered part of the cure. Long corridors lined with tall windows were designed to flood the wards with natural light, under the belief that sunshine and fresh air could sweep out the fog of madness. Gardens and exercise yards lay within the high perimeter walls, where patients could take prescribed walks under watchful eyes, breathing the clipped hedges and trimmed lawns that replaced the riot of their ungoverned thoughts. Sleep, in this design, was never just rest. It was a measure of order restored. Superintendents and doctors kept detailed records of who slept, who tossed and turned, who woke screaming. A patient who lay quietly through the night, even if they rose each day as silent and hollow as before, was praised as a sign that the system worked. A patient who raged or wept through the dark hours was marked as a failure to be restrained, sedated, or isolated until calmness could be forced back into them. Yet all the charts and ledgers could not capture the simple truth that sleep in these wards was often less secure than a fragile escape. A few hours when the clang of keys and the echo of boots faded into dreams that, for a time, might recall a garden path, a mother's voice, the warmth of a lost home. For some, those flickers were enough to survive the next day's labor and the next night's vigil beneath the thin wool blankets and flickering gaslight. And so the cycle of moral treatment turned on itself. Routine by day, restless dreams by night, promises of cure that too often blurred into the hush of sedation or the silence of exhaustion. Behind the neat gardens and clipped hedges of the Victorian Asylum, beyond the workshops, laundry yards, and locked wards, lay one final, hidden piece of its world, the asylum graveyard. It was here that many who lay restless and watchful through countless nights inside those brick walls found their last, longest sleep. Few visitors ever saw these grounds. They were often tucked at the far edge of the estate, screened by hedges or low stone walls. The asylum burial ground was a necessity that the institutions did not care to advertise, a quiet reminder that for many, committal meant not only leaving the world outside but never returning to it in life or in death. When a patient died, it was noted in the same careful ledgers that recorded their admission. The cause of death, consumption, pneumonia, wasting, suicide, was written in looping ink beside their name. A brief note might mention if family had been notified, but many patients had none who could come to claim them. For these souls, the asylum itself became both their keeper and their only mourner. The bodies were washed in the same stone washrooms where uniforms were scrubbed each dawn. Nurses prepared the dead just as they had tended them in life, hair combed flat, a plain shroud tied at the neck and feet. There were no coffins for the pauper dead, only a cheap wooden box reused again and again. The burial plots were narrow, cut into rows that stretched behind the asylum's outer walls. Some graveyards kept the grass trimmed and the simple markers upright, but many became overgrown quickly, the small wooden crosses or plain numbered stones swallowed by weeds and nettles. Sleep in the graveyard was absolute and, for some, perhaps the first true peace they had known since passing through the asylum's iron gates. The quiet rows bore no epitaphs beyond a number carved into stone or stenciled on fading wood. The institution's records alone knew who lay beneath each patch of earth. Mary Whitcomb, Sarah the gentle laundress, the old man who swept the garden paths for years until his thin heart gave out on a winter morning. For the world outside, they had already vanished long before the ground claimed them. Despite the silence that hung over these burial grounds, the dead did not always rest untouched. In the same century when moral treatment sought to heal the mind, medicine was desperate to understand the secrets hidden within it. Asylums often supplied bodies to medical schools and training hospitals, an unspoken trade that turned the asylum's dead into anatomy lessons for young surgeons. Families who did come to reclaim their lost relatives sometimes found them already taken apart on marble tables under the harsh gaslights of hospital operating theaters. Even for those who escaped dissection, remembrance was thin. Very few families erected headstones. The graveyard was a place of shame for many, an unwanted reminder of a branch of the family tree that polite conversation would rather prune away. Over time, new wings of the asylum might be built over the burial ground's older sections, the neat rows lost beneath foundations and manicured lawns. Yet despite this neglect, traces of those buried lives lingered. In some asylums, staff and a few patients gathered for simple burials, a chaplain reading psalms over the fresh-dug earth, nurses standing at the edge, caps pinned tight in the wind, heads bowed. For a moment, the great machine of routine paused. The straitjackets and sedatives, the baths and bedpans, all of it held still while one more name slipped quietly into the ground behind the high walls. Back in the wards, the living turned their thoughts away from the burial plot. For the patients, talk of death was discouraged. To speak of escape, even by grave, was a sign of dangerous melancholy. And yet, in whispered prayers or sleepless confessions, many carried that secret hope, that when sleep finally came, it would not be interrupted by jangling keys or the bark of an attendant's command. That it would be deep, dreamless, and free. By the final decades of the Victorian era, new voices rose to challenge the old ways. Reformers called for smaller, kinder institutions, for care at home, for treatment that sought to heal rather than simply contain. Yet for countless thousands who passed through the iron gates of the great county asylums, these changes came too late. They lived and died within walls that promised order and cure but more often offered only endless routine, uneasy dreams, and a last sleep beneath unmarked earth. Today, many of those graveyards lie forgotten, buried under parking lots, hospital expansions, or reclaimed by tangled hedgerows. But sometimes, if you walk the grounds of an old asylum turned to ruin or museum, you may still find a row of sinking stones, each marked by a fading number. Each number a name once spoken, a bed once laid upon, a mind once restless in the endless night. So we stand here now, at the edge of those vanished grounds, listening for echoes that have grown faint with time yet linger stubbornly in the brickwork and overgrown paths where the asylum once rose against the cold English sky. If you close your eyes, you might still hear the distant murmur of restless voices, the creak of iron bedsteads, the low footsteps of an attendant pacing the midnight halls. All those countless nights when sleep came not as a mercy but as a fragile reprieve, and for so many, never came easily at all. What remains is not just a record in ledgers or a scattering of unmarked stones beneath the grass. What remains is a reminder of what it meant to be hidden away, filed neatly under the cause of madness, treated by well-meaning hands and, too often, by cold instruments that mistook silence for cure. Each patient, like Mary, like Sarah, like the old men sweeping garden paths, carried within them a whole life that flickered on, even as the asylum walls tried to contain it. The Victorian Asylum was a monument to both fear and hope, fear of what the human mind could become when untethered, and hope that order and routine might bind it back to the light. Sometimes that hope found a sliver of truth. A patient walked out the front gates once more, blinking in the sunlight. But far more often, they lingered until that final restless vigil ended in the hush of the asylum graveyard, where sleep was at last complete. When we look back now, it's tempting to see only cruelty in those iron keys and endless wards. But there were moments, small, fragile ones, when kindness found its way in, a nurse adjusting a thin blanket, a whispered song at a patient's bedside, a moment of warmth by a garden wall. Such moments did not rewrite the story, but they softened its hardest lines. So tonight, as you close your eyes in your own warm room, remember the narrow beds where sleep was a rare visitor, the cold stone floors that carried footsteps through the dark, the silent prayers offered to a locked window for just a little mercy when the lamps went out. And remember too the quiet promise hidden behind the harshest walls, that even in the bleakest corners of our history, we find traces of humanity clinging on, small, stubborn lights that refuse to die. Thank you for wandering down these shadowed corridors with me tonight. May your own sleep be warm, peaceful, and yours to keep.